3 astronauts were sealed inside an American spacecraft, but they were not in space. They were not on the way to the moon. They were not sitting on top of a fueled rocket waiting for launch. They were on the ground, at Cape Kennedy, surrounded by engineers, technicians, radios, ladders, procedures, and rescue teams. That is what makes Apollo 1 so disturbing. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were close enough to Earth that help was only a few meters away, yet when the fire started, those few meters became impossible to cross. The test was supposed to be routine. The Saturn rocket beneath them was not loaded with fuel. The spacecraft was being checked before its first crewed mission. To the outside world, the real danger was still waiting somewhere in the future, during launch, during orbit, or maybe one day near the moon. But the danger was already inside the capsule. It was in the air they were breathing. It was in the materials around them. It was in the wiring, the pressure, the hatch, the schedule, and the quiet belief that a ground test could not become a death trap. Before Apollo could become a symbol of American triumph, it became a locked room filled with fire. And before NASA could reach the moon, it had to face the disaster it could not escape. On January 27, 1967, Apollo was still more promise than achievement. NASA had flown Mercury. NASA had mastered much of Gemini. Americans had seen astronauts orbit Earth, walk in space, dock spacecraft, and survive missions that only a few years earlier would have sounded impossible. But Apollo was different. Apollo was not just another step. Apollo was the machine that was supposed to carry human beings to the moon. Every bolt, wire, hatch, switch, and checklist carried the pressure of a national deadline. The United States wanted to win the space race, and NASA was building the program while the world was watching. The first crewed Apollo mission was supposed to prove that the new command module could finally carry astronauts beyond the testing phase and into history. The crew knew exactly what that meant. Gus Grissom was one of America's original astronauts, a veteran of Mercury and Gemini, and a man who understood risk without romanticizing it. Ed White had become the first American to walk in space, floating outside Gemini 4 with Earth beneath him. Roger Chaffee had not flown yet, but he had trained with the focus of someone preparing to join the most dangerous profession in the world. Together, they were not just a crew. They were the first human test of the spacecraft that would eventually have to take Americans to the moon. But Apollo 1 did not feel clean. The command module had problems. The crew had complained about communications. There were frustrations with wiring, workmanship, procedures, and the general feeling that the spacecraft was not as ready as the schedule needed it to be. Grissom, especially, was not a man who smiled politely at a machine he did not trust. In one now famous photo, the crew posed with a model of the Apollo spacecraft, heads bowed as if praying over it. It was partly humor, but it also felt like a warning. The men who were supposed to fly Apollo knew the capsule still had too many ways to betray them. The test that day was called a plugs-out test. The idea was to see whether the spacecraft could operate on its own power, disconnected from external support, as it would during a real mission. That sounds serious, but it was not treated like a launch. The rocket was not fueled. The vehicle was sitting on the pad. There was no plan for ignition, no climb into the sky, no violent escape from Earth. Because of that, the test was not treated as one of the most dangerous moments of the program. That assumption became fatal. Grissom, White, and Chaffee entered the command module and were sealed inside. The cabin was filled with pure oxygen and pressurized above the outside atmosphere. In spaceflight, oxygen systems had practical advantages. They reduced complexity and weight. They had been used before. But inside a closed spacecraft on the ground, under pressure, pure oxygen changed the meaning of every material in the cabin. Things that might resist burning in normal air could ignite and spread violently. Fabric, Velcro, nylon, insulation, netting, checklists, wiring covers, small details that seemed manageable in ordinary conditions became part of a hidden fire path. A spacecraft cabin is not an empty metal shell. It is a crowded room built around survival, filled with equipment, cables, hoses, panels, controls, and human necessities. Apollo 1 placed 3 men inside that crowded room and then filled it with an atmosphere that made fire far more aggressive. The test dragged on. Communications were bad. The crew had trouble hearing the ground, and the ground had trouble hearing the crew. Grissom grew frustrated and asked how they were going to get to the moon if they could not talk between 2 or 3 buildings. That line should have frozen everyone. It captured the contradiction of Apollo in one sentence. NASA was trying to reach another world while still struggling with basic failures on Earth. But the test continued because the program had to move forward, and because delays were normal, and because frustration was not the same thing as catastrophe. Not yet. At 6:31 p.m., the illusion of control ended. The exact ignition source was never identified with absolute certainty, but investigators later found evidence pointing toward electrical arcing in a spacecraft already filled with fire hazards. In another environment, the first spark might have been a problem. In Apollo 1, it became a catastrophe. A voice came over the communication loop, "Fire in the cockpit." Then the situation became worse almost instantly. There was a bad fire. Then came the words that still feel unbearable decades later: they were burning up. Outside the command module, the people on the pad did not immediately understand the full scale of what had happened. Inside, there was no time to understand anything slowly. Fire and pure oxygen moved with terrifying speed. The cabin pressure rose. Heat built violently. Smoke and toxic gases filled the spacecraft. The same sealed environment designed to protect astronauts from the vacuum of space now trapped them inside a burning chamber. And then the hatch became the final cruelty. The Apollo hatch opened inward. Under rising internal pressure, it could not be opened quickly. Ed White, the astronaut who had once floated outside Gemini 4 above Earth, was responsible for opening it in an emergency. Think about that image carefully. The first American to walk in space was now on Earth, inside a spacecraft, trying to open a door that would not open fast enough. Rescue teams fought to reach the crew, but they were facing smoke, heat, poor visibility, and a spacecraft that had never been prepared for this kind of internal fire. The most violent phase of the fire lasted only seconds, but seconds were enough. By the time the hatch was opened, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were gone. They had not died in orbit. They had not died during launch. They had not died near the moon. They died on the pad, during a test that many people had not believed could kill them. Before we go deeper into what NASA found after the hatch opened, subscribe to Orbit Ledger and like this video if you want more real stories about the moments when space history almost broke completely. Because Apollo 1 was not just a tragedy. It was an accusation. The burned command module forced NASA to confront something far more uncomfortable than a single spark. The investigation did not find one simple villain, one broken switch, or one dramatic mistake that explained everything. It found a chain. A vulnerable electrical system. A cabin filled with combustible materials. A pure oxygen atmosphere under pressure. A hatch that could not be opened quickly in an emergency. Poor emergency preparation. Communication problems. A test that was not treated with the danger it actually carried. That is what makes Apollo 1 so important and so frightening. The crew was not killed by one impossible failure. They were killed by an environment where many acceptable risks had been allowed to overlap. Each decision may have had an explanation. Each material may have had a reason. Each procedure may have passed through a system that believed it was managing danger. But when all of it came together, the spacecraft became a trap. NASA wanted speed because the moon race demanded speed. Contractors wanted to deliver. Engineers were trying to solve thousands of problems at once. Managers were trying to keep the program alive under political and public pressure. And inside that pressure, warnings became easier to explain away. The Apollo 1 crew had questioned the spacecraft before the fire. They had seen the problems from inside the machine. But the system around them had not yet learned the lesson that spaceflight teaches again and again: danger does not care whether a test is supposed to be routine. It only cares whether the conditions are ready. After Apollo 1, the race to the moon stopped. Not forever, but long enough for NASA to look directly at the machine it had built. The command module was redesigned. Combustible materials were removed or reduced. Wiring was improved. The hatch was changed to open outward and much faster. Ground test procedures were rewritten. Emergency planning changed. The cabin atmosphere used during testing changed. NASA's understanding of risk changed because it had no other choice. This is the part of the Apollo story that often gets buried under the glory of Apollo 11. The moon landing was not created only by ambition, courage, and brilliant engineering. It was also shaped by grief, failure, and the burned remains of Command Module 012. Every later Apollo crew flew in a spacecraft changed by Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Their deaths did not automatically make Apollo safe. People had to do that work. Engineers had to redesign. Investigators had to be honest. Managers had to accept that schedule pressure could not be allowed to outrank crew survival. But Apollo 1 forced that transformation. When Apollo 7 finally carried astronauts into Earth orbit in 1968, the memory of the fire was still there. When Apollo 8 circled the moon, it was still there. When Apollo 11 descended toward the lunar surface in 1969, it was still there, hidden inside the improved hatch, the cleaner cabin, the stricter procedures, and the deeper respect for what a spacecraft could do wrong. Apollo 1 did not end the dream of reaching the moon. It made the dream more honest. It reminded NASA that American courage was not enough by itself. Patriotism could not open a bad hatch. Confidence could not make unsafe materials safe. A deadline could not turn a flawed spacecraft into a reliable one. If Apollo was going to reach the moon, it first had to survive the truth about itself. Today, Apollo 1 remains one of the most painful warnings in the history of spaceflight because the danger arrived where people least expected it. Everyone fears the rocket. Everyone fears the vacuum. Everyone fears the unknown silence beyond Earth. But Grissom, White, and Chaffee were not lost in the silence of space. They were lost in a spacecraft on the ground, close to help, close to home, close to the people who had built the machine around them. That is why the story still feels so claustrophobic. The distance was small, but the barrier was absolute. A few meters separated the crew from the outside world, and those few meters might as well have been the distance to the moon. Apollo 1 is not remembered because NASA failed to imagine greatness. NASA imagined the moon with extraordinary clarity. It imagined lunar orbit, landing legs, spacesuits, sample bags, flags, footprints, and the return home. What it had not fully imagined was fire inside the capsule before the mission even began. It had not fully imagined 3 astronauts trapped during a ground test. And in that failure of imagination, 3 men paid the price before Apollo ever carried a crew into space. The program continued. The moon landing came. The world remembers the triumph. But behind that triumph is a locked hatch, a flash of flame, and a lesson written into every spacecraft that followed. Before Apollo became humanity's greatest leap, it became a room no one could escape.